He killed every person in his family just about. Killing the babies in Bethlehem was no big deal. So you wonder how horrendous of a thing that was. All right, well, thank y'all for coming. Welcome to week 2 of Herod the Great. We're going to have 3 weeks probably of Herod the Great. He's a pretty complicated fellow and has some pretty complicated descendants of whom we read a lot about in the Bible, actually. So next week we're going to cover that. We see the overlapping. So everything we've done so far has been kind of like introductory information for the New Testament, right? We know we see the history of how the sects formed, how the Hasidians formed the philosophy of the Hasidim, and the philosophy of the Hasidim morphed into the Pharisees. So we see all this kind of introductory material to New Testament stuff. Today, starting today, and certainly next week, we're going to see a true overlap between stuff that's going on intertestament-wise, these people we're talking about, and people of the New Testament. Okay, so we'll see the Herodians and how they interact with Jesus, how they interact with the apostles. Okay, so it's kind of coming to the history that we're more familiar with, probably. So this week we're going to cover the projects that Herod the Great did. Next week we're going to cover his descendants and talk about how they really interacted with the Bible. And do you know the difference between Herod Antipas? Do you know the difference between Herod Archelaus? Do you know the difference between Agrippa the First, Agrippa the Second? Okay, I have a lot of trouble keeping those guys straight. So hopefully by next week we're going to really delve into that, and hopefully by the end of next week everyone will really have a good, firm understanding of who these guys were, who these different guys were. But this week, we're going to wrap up a couple things about Herod the Great. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Mount Arbel. Remember Herod the Great, before he became Herod the Great, Herod the Mediocre? He was going around running away from the Parthians. He'd run here and there and everywhere. And then he went to Cleopatra in Egypt, and she wanted him to stay. And he said, no, I'm not going to stay. And he ended up going to Rome. And there he was proclaimed King of the Jews. Kind of a surprise to Herod that he was proclaimed King of the Jews, okay? But then as King of the Jews, he then came back to Palestine and started taking over Palestine. He started cleaning things out, just like the Romans did 70 years later when Rome took over Jerusalem and then all the land. He started by cleaning out everything around Jerusalem. He left Jerusalem for the last, okay? One of the places he was cleaning out was Mount Arbel. Okay, this is Mount Arbel. I showed you some pictures 2 weeks ago of the caves of Mount Arbel. And I mentioned that we went, when we went here, we were traveling with a couple of companions, Shireen and Shireen's mom. We don't know her name. So Shireen, you're watching the video, Shireen's mom, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. But anyway, so we were walking around Mount Arbel, and it's a little bit of a hike up from the visitor center to where the caves are. We were actually on the top. I think you can go down below also and see the caves, but we were on top and looking around at things, and Shireen's mom got tired, so Shelly and Shireen's mom started back to the visitor center, and Shireen and I went around to get some pictures of the caves. And Shireen was much more brave than I was. She was climbing down, I mean, nothing dangerous, but she was climbing down a little more and taking pictures of the caves and the side of the mountain and whatever. So what you don't see here is this. I didn't show Shelley the slide before this morning's class. That's Shelley right there. So the Mount Arbel is kind of a little bit of a U shape here. So we were standing over on this part of the U, and Shelley and Shireen's mom were going back to the visitor center over on this side. So Shireen's mom was sitting down on some rocks there, and it looks kind of precarious. Looks like she's right on the edge of the cliff, getting ready to fall off the edge of the cliff, but she's not. Shireen was climbing down among the rocks, and I was over there just kind of standing around, whatever. So that's Shelley looking, yikes, no. It wasn't as bad as it looked, really. At least for me. Like I say, I was against the face of the rock, screaming like a little girl. So anyway, I wanted to point that out to you. All right, Herod the Great and the babies. So we're just kind of wrapping up some stuff. It's more loose ends. We're talking about Herod the Great today, okay? So as far as the babies of Bethlehem, I went and looked at 32 different versions of the Bible. And in none of those, including the King James, it says that all the babies were killed, okay? But the rest of the 32 versions said baby boys were killed. So I've heard it both ways. You know, the baby boys were killed in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem, and all the babies were killed in Bethlehem. And that's why, because the different translations translate it differently, okay? So we're starting to see some of the overlap now between the Herodian family. We've kind of grown the Herodian family, right? All the way back to the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and even back to Alexander the Great and whatever. We've kind of gone through the history of this and how Herod the Great took over the Hasmonean family and wiped them all out and how he came to power and whatever. So now we're starting to see the overlap with the history that we're more familiar with in the New Testament. Okay, so Matthew 2, we see this story of Herod killing the babies in Bethlehem. It was his modus operandi. He killed every person in his family just about. Killing the babies in Bethlehem was no big deal. So you wonder how horrendous of a thing that was. Well, there's a couple of different points to make, okay? First of all, infanticide was not a big deal back then. People killed their babies all the time. If you were a Roman and you didn't want your, particularly if it was a girl, if you didn't want that little baby girl, you'd go and leave it on a trash heap. No big deal. Sickening, very sickening. So I always wondered kind of why Josephus never tells this story in his works, okay? There's many different reasons for that, okay? Just another day in the life of Herod. Bethlehem was a small village, maybe 300 people, maybe a dozen infants or so. No big deal. You kill a dozen infants, another day in the life of Herod. Josephus was writing for a Greco-Roman audience. He perhaps did not consider this act noteworthy compared to other things that Herod did, like in killing his family members or whatever. Perhaps he didn't even think about it when he was writing about it. So I don't know why Josephus didn't cover it, but he didn't. But it certainly is something that Herod fit his character and certainly something that Herod did do. Okay? Now, there are several times that Herod almost died. He had a bunch of assassination attempts against him. The first time was several men were going to assassinate him while he was bathing, but backed out the last minute. They snuck out. Herod must have been a very imposing figure, but they backed out at the last minute and did not do that. Another occasions when he was getting ready to bathe again, they were going to kill him on his way to bathe, and they saw him, they were terrified and ran to the house. That might have been the same incident, recounted in two different books, Antiquities and Wars. 10 men conspired later to kill Herod with daggers. Herod heard about the conspiracy and ended up having them killed. Herod had spies all over the place. Okay, any conspiracies against him, he found out about them. He's pretty much guaranteed to find out about them because he had spies all over. In fact, he would sometimes disguise himself and go out in the streets of Jerusalem and, what do you think about Herod the Great? And they said, well, I just really don't like him. Well, they didn't last long. Another possible conspiracy led by Alexander, one of Herod's kids, by Mariamne I, was to make it look like an accident when Herod fell off his horse and he impaled himself with his sword. Another conspiracy, a man named Corinthus, one of Herod's bodyguards, conspired with another person to kill him. Of course, Herod found out about that conspiracy and took care of those folks. And then another conspiracy by his son Antipater III, and a bunch of other people in a conspiracy to poison him. And we're going to cover that in detail later because that was a pretty wide and deep conspiracy. That was his eldest son, Antipater III, and a bunch of other people were involved in it. His first wife, Doris, was involved in that. His brother, there's a pile of people involved in that. Very deep, very wide conspiracy. He found out about it. He tortured a bunch of people and found out a lot more about it. And he took care of the problem like Herod the Great always did. We'll talk about that probably next week. There were a lot of times that Herod almost died by suicide. When he was fleeing from the Parthians, and Antigonus II, he tried to kill himself with a sword. Remember, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, where the chariot or the horse or wagon or whatever his mom was riding in turned over and fell on his mom, and his mom about died. And he said, I'm just going to end it all. And he was getting ready to stab himself, and the guy said, don't do that. Where does that leave us? we're 9,000 of your closest friends. Remember, we talked about how he had 9,000 people running from the Parthians. He ended up leaving 800 of them on Masada. And kept running from the Parthians, and that's when he went to Rome and became king of the Jews. Okay, so he tried to kill himself then. How different history would have been if he had killed himself then. Soon before he died, he tried to kill himself with a small knife because he was in so much pain. We'll talk about his death here in just a minute. And his cousin kept him from stabbing himself. There are other times Herod almost died. We know about one occasion where the roof of a house collapsed soon after a feast with many of the principal men, including Herod the Great. He was nearly shipwrecked close to Pamphylia. During his war with Antigonus, he was struck with a javelin in his side. He's a pretty tough old guy. If I'd had javelin in my side, I'm just going to die right there. I don't care, whatever. Just a little nick and I'm dead. He accidentally impaled himself with a spear when he fell from his horse during a hunting trip. And this is alluded to in the conspiracy of Alexander against Herod. His death. Josephus goes into quite a bit of detail of how Herod died. He had an intense burning sensation inside, a vehement appetite. His intestines were ulcerated. He had violent pain in his colon. He left a trail of clear liquid wherever he went. His privy member was putrefied and produced worms. He had difficulty breathing. His breath stank, and he had convulsions throughout his body. I just have one word for that, ew. Josephus is kind of describing how I feel in the morning when I get up. I don't know. Some mornings, depends if it's a good morning or not, I guess. So he tried to kill himself on this occasion, but he was stopped by his cousin, Achabius. Okay? People speculated it may have been kidney failure, may have been heart failure, may have been both. I don't know. There's been different theories of looking at these symptoms that Josephus gives us. Maybe one of those two things that he did. Okay, before he died, he knew he was getting ready to die. Okay, he did several things. First of all, he commanded all the principal men of the Jews, one out of every family, to be gathered up. Take one of these people out of every family, put them in the hippodrome. I'm going to show you a picture of a hippodrome in a minute, where they did horse races. Put them in the hippodrome, and as soon as I die, shoot them with arrows. Kill every one of them. He had a great plan. He was afraid that they wouldn't mourn. He was afraid there'd be joyful in the street, jumping around. Oh, Herod the Great is finally dead. Oh, my goodness. Well, he couldn't have that. So he was guaranteeing that there would be sadness throughout all the land when he killed all these principal guys in every single family in the land when he gathered them together. Luckily, his sister Salome and his son Archelaus didn't think that was a good idea, and they let the people go. That's good. They did something right for once. We're going to see more about Salome and more, particularly Archelaus. Archelaus was kind of Herod the Great without the good qualities, except for this one occasion. His last will, he ordered the execution of his son, his eldest son, Antipater III. We will talk about that in some detail. He appointed Antipas, a son of his sixth wife, to be tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. He appointed Archelaus to be king. This was his last will. There's some conflict between his last will and testament and his former will and testament that Caesar Augustus had to figure out. We'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. He named Philip the tetrarch, a son of his seventh wife, to be tetrarch of Gaulonitis, Trachonitis, and Panias. His benefactors, he gave a significant amount of money to his commanders and friends. He paid each soldier 50 drachma. Since 1 dram is 1 denarius, that's about 50 days' pay. Okay. He gave Jamni, Ashdod, and Phasaelus to his sister Salome, along with 500,000 drachma of silver. He gave Caesar Augustus 10 million drachma of coin money, along with gold and silver vessels. Yeah, that's a lot. He gave costly garments to Livia Drusilla, who was Caesar's wife. Okay, so that's what he did right before he died. We were very lucky when we went to Israel in November, I think, of 2013. There was a temporary exhibit that showed the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. They just found it. It was found in 2007 by Ehud Netzer. Okay, Netzer died right after it was found. He was out at Herodian. He leaned against a rail, and the rail gave way, and he fell, and he died 3 days later, unfortunately. So this exhibit at the Israel Museum, when we were there, that happened from February 2013 through January 2014, was in memory of Ehud Netzer, who died after finding the sarcophagus. It's been his life goal to find the sarcophagus of Herod the Great, and he did. Very likely that is the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. Okay, it's made of red sandstone, high-quality craftsmanship. Wasn't a bunch of pieces. The Jews didn't like Herod the Great. They probably smashed it up and took the bones and did no telling what to them. And as I said, it was on its first exhibit. But we could not take pictures. This picture is not something that I took, unfortunately, because the Israel Museum is very strict about picture taking, which we found out. I was trying to take a picture, and the guard said, that's just not going to happen. So, okay, fine. But I'm writing a book. Don't you understand? I'm writing a book. All right. Now, one thing I want to talk about here is the difference between I've talked about this before, but just to emphasize it again, the difference between a sarcophagus and an ossuary. A sarcophagus contained the full body of a person, okay? An ossuary contained the bones of a person. So a sarcophagus had to be 6 feet-ish tall or something, right, to contain the full person. An ossuary had to be as long as the long bone in a leg, okay? So usually after a year, they would go to the sarcophagus or the cave or wherever they happened to bury somebody, and they'd gather up the bones, and they would put them in an ossuary, okay? Shelley and I and Kenny and Joanne about 3 weeks ago went and saw in Atlanta the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus. And whether that really is the ossuary of him or not, they have some pretty convincing evidence that it is. In fact, they say in their exhibit that the evidence is really close to 100% that this really is the ossuary of James. So that was kind of cool. But it was about this big, right? From what I remember, about this big when we saw it. But a sarcophagus, like I say, we saw in the Israel Museum was much bigger. We also saw, when we were there, the Mausoleum and Bathtub of Herod the Great. I don't know if it's marble or granite. I'm not sure. But it was pretty nice. There's a picture of it. And we also saw construction of the Mausoleum, of the pieces that they found that were around the sarcophagus. That was all buried in the sand that Netzer had been looking for years. Okay. All right. So when he died, there was some conflict over his will. Again, he had an original will, and then he had a last will and testament. Maybe he didn't put the words in there, this will supersedes any other wills that I had, whatever. But the two wills had to be adjudicated by somebody, so that was adjudicated by Caesar Augustus, Herod the Great's boss, essentially, the emperor at this time of Rome. Okay? So, an earlier one stated Antipas should be king, while the one right before his death stated that Archelaus should be king. It would have been a lot better if Antipas had been made king, but we'll talk about some of that as we go. Remember that Antipater III, that we'll talk about soon, Aristobulus IV, and Alexander were all dead. So these three guys right here were all dead. His eldest son, Aristobulus, and Alexander are the sons of Mariamne, his second wife. Remember, he strangled them in BC 7. And we're going to talk about that too, how he brought them to trial and stuff. Pretty interesting stuff. So all the boys went to Rome to see Caesar Augustus, and most of Herod's family went to Antipas, a kinder, gentler man. That's the old George H.W. Bush terminology, a kinder, gentler. So I like using that. Antipas was a kinder, gentler man. Most of the Jews petitioned Augustus for Judea be made as part of the Syrian province, and Caesar, of course, went off and thought about it and made his decision. This is what first of all, I'll tell you what he came up with. These are the arguments for Antipas and against Archelaus. So there's three groups of people that came along. Four groups of people that came along. Those for Archelaus, those for Antipas, those for Philip the Tetrarch, which he didn't really have a leg to stand on, okay, but he kind of wanted in the action. And then those Jews that were saying, don't put us under any Herod, just make us part of the Syrian province, under the governor of the Syrian province. Josephus calls those presidents, if you read Josephus. So four different camps. The two main camps were the people who were for Antipas and against Archelaus. They said that Archelaus, acted as king before he was king. These are these arguments to Caesar. He said he released the prisoners from the Hippodrome. Oh, bad Archelaus. All these Jews, all the first Jews from every family that were gathered in the Hippodrome to be killed. Archelaus, let them go, bad guy. Right? This is their argument against Archelaus. I don't know if that's really a good argument or not. They said that he acted merrily during the time of his father's mourning. He slaughtered the Jews on Passover. These are all true statements. And Herod only mentioned Archelaus in his will during his last days of pain. Okay? The other side of the story now, for Archelaus, they said, well, the last will of Herod should be carried out. That's the way our law is today, right? I can write 37 wills, and it's the last will that counts. Okay? So that was their point. Herod came up with Archelaus should be the guy. That's the last will and testament of Herod the Great. And Caesar should not annul the last will of a friend and confederate. All right. So a few days later, this is what Caesar Augustus came up with. Okay? Archelaus would be ethnarch, and an ethnarch is a ruler of an ethnic group. And basically he would get one half of what Herod had. He would be over Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, along with the cities of Stratos, Tyre, which was now Caesarea Maritima, okay, Sebaste, Joppa, and Jerusalem. This inheritance would provide income of about 600 talents per year. How much is a talent? Well, a Roman talent, if you go to my website, is, $261,000. And again, if you go to the website, you can argue with me about how I came up with that, but I have at least a methodology of how I came up with that amount of money, okay? Rhonda said a couple of weeks ago, she said, why would anyone fool with this? Why would anyone just run from the Parthians and have to deal with people conspiring to kill you all the time and all this stuff? Why would anyone do this? Well, he had a lot of money, and he was able to gather a lot of money over the years. Remember, he financed the temple out of his own money, out of his own pocket. He built all these amazing places, Caesarea Maritima. It's just, he had a lot of money, and he had a lot of power, and that's why people would do this. Whether that's worth doing or not, I don't know. Some people, it's worth doing. Okay. Antipas, he would be a tetrarch, which means a ruler of a fourth part. Okay. He would rule Perea and Galilee. His inheritance would be about $52 million a year. I can live on that. Philip the Tetrarch, he got an inheritance about $26 million. He got Iturea, Gaulonitis, and Trachonitis, $26 million a year. Again, you can argue, so this could be $10 million. I don't know. It depends on how you do the math. It could be $100 million. But we're in the ballpark of probably tens of millions of dollars. Okay. Salome, Herod's sister, got the cities of Jamni, Ashdod, and Phasaelis, and also 500,000 drachma of silver, and an income of about $16 million a year. I could still live on that. Okay, Salome did all right. Herod's two daughters, his youngest daughters, Salome and Roxana, received what his will has stipulated, plus an additional 250,000 drachma of silver, which is $11 million, and then Caesar, married them to Pheroras, Herod's brother's sons. Okay. The other children received what Herod's will has stipulated, plus they broke up 1,500 talents among them. Archelaus got really the bulk of what we think of as Israel today, but including the West Bank. So the West Bank is over here is the west bank of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River runs from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. Okay, so the West Bank is right here today. So what Archelaus had really encompassed all of Israel, all of the West Bank. In fact, it even went down, well, not as far, because Israel today goes all the way down to Elat, which is on the coast down there on the Red Sea. Okay. Antipas had Perea and Galilee. So Antipas right here in the orange, and right here in the orange. And Philip had Iturea, Gaulonitis, and Trachonitis right up here. Okay, so this is over here, this is all Jordan now, today. This is all getting up into Syria. Sidon is up in Syria, Tyre is in Syria, so this is all Syria today. So that's what they had. Salome has these little carve-outs right here in yellow. Ascalon, Azotus, Phasaelis. That's kind of how the area broke up. And of course the dotted line is what Herod the Great had. So all this dotted area was broken up amongst his sons and his descendants. Now, you know how as we've gone along, we've kind of had our baseline chart of Palestine, who ruled Palestine. You know, this is the chart of Palestine. We're just looking, and we looked at, from Alexander the Great, how he took over from the Persians, and then we led into the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans and on and Herod the Great, whatever. Okay, so this is kind of going to be our baseline chart from here on. Okay, because this shows who all ruled what. Now, it's a little confusing. We have the regions across the top, okay, 9 of them. Chalcis, it kind of doesn't matter really over here, but these 8 regions right here matter. Herod the Great ruled all these regions while he was king of the Jews, okay? When he died, it was split up amongst Archelaus, his son, Antipas, ethnarch here, tetrarch here, and another tetrarch here, Philip, okay? Archelaus had the bulk of what we think of as Israel today. Okay, Archelaus was a bad guy. Again, he was kind of like Herod the Great without the good qualities. That's saying something, let me tell you. Okay, so he was a bad guy, and he was actually deposed by the emperor Octavian in AD 6. In AD 6 is when we see the name change from Judea, Samaria, Idumea into a province called Judea. Those 3 were combined in the province of Judea. Okay, and then that province, after Archelaus was banished, got put under the prefects. Okay? And we're familiar with some of those. We're familiar certainly with Pontius Pilate, who was around the time of Jesus. Okay? We then see Antipas taking these regions here, Galilee, Perea, and Philip taking the rest of the region. And as they died out, different things happen. Okay? So initially, when Philip the Tetrarch died out, this was added to the Syrian province. So a very short time between AD 34 and 37. And then Agrippa I came along, the grandson of Herod the Great. Okay? He came along and started taking, it's hard to see in the resolution of the chart, but see, he first started taking over right here. He took over the regions from the Syrian province, took over these 3 regions, okay? And then as people died out, as Antipas died out, he took over these 2 regions, okay? When eventually, he was really good friends with some of the emperors as they came along. He eventually became king over these 3 regions. So he ended up with the exact same territory that his grandfather had controlled. Okay? Kind of interesting. And he's the last one that did. His son, Herod Agrippa II, never did control that much. He took over these three regions first, and then he took over this region, and he took over part of this region at a time, but he never took over Judea. If he had, we might be able to go see the temple today. Because who took over Judea? First of all, the prefects, and then the procurators. And if you were at my talk 6 months ago, and when we talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, those were bad guys, okay? Agrippa, the two Agrippas were actually not too bad guys as far as leaders, as far as rulers go. We'll talk about some of that as we go. And they were pretty pro-Jew anyway. So if they had been around, if Herod Agrippa II had ruled instead of these procurators, Jerusalem may never have fallen, okay? Anyway, that's going to be our baseline chart as we go. That's just kind of an introduction to it. I've showed it before, I know, in the past, a time or two, but we'll kind of show that here and there. All right, so we're going to talk about his building projects. He embarked on a spending spree after he killed his wife, Mariamne I. He felt actually kind of bad about that, I think, and her mother, Alexandra, first of all. And we're going to point out 13 of these. These are not any particular, not particular order or anything, whatever. I've just picked kind of 13 of the big ones randomly. So these are some of the bigger ones he did. First of all was the Temple Mount. Now, when you build a house, the first thing you do is you got to put down your foundation, right? You go and you grade out the land, you pour a little concrete and build up maybe some blocks or whatever. So you think of the Temple Mount and so, okay, well, you just graded some land and wasn't that much to it. This was a huge, huge project. The Temple Mount's 37 acres. And it's so strong, so resilient, you can go walk there today. We did. You can go up there and tromp around the Temple Mount. Very cool. Very cool to be able to do that and know that Herod the Great is the one that built that. Okay? So it's lasted for 2,000 years. It'll probably last another 2,000 years. Okay? So he added to the north, and we're going to talk about this in just a second. I'll show you a slide. He added the north, south, and west sides of the existing mount. Total size, 37 acres. And this is the mount that still exists today. And this is a picture. I took this photograph at the Israel Museum. They have this giant model that covers an acre. I don't know, pretty big. In fact, we spent a lot of time out there at that model just taking pictures and sitting there and thinking, wow, that's so cool. And then we didn't have enough time to do the rest of the museum. So anyway, this is a model of the Temple Mount at the Israel Museum today. There's a bunch of models of the Temple and Temple Mount here and there. And I try to go around and see what I can around the world and around the country. Okay. If you were at my talk 6 months ago, we talked about the first wall, the Hasmoneans, the second wall, the Hasmoneans, Jerusalem. This is what Jerusalem looked like at the time of Jesus. And then the Temple Mount is in the light blue area right here. Okay? The city of Jerusalem is in red. That is the ancient city of Jerusalem, the current walls of Jerusalem. And I talked about it 6 months ago, that you can actually go up on the walls of Jerusalem and walk around and see down the stuff that's going on. That was really, really cool to be able to do that. So we walked around these entire walls of Jerusalem. But the Temple Mount takes up a pretty big chunk of Jerusalem. That's shown in yellow there. We talked about, 6 months ago again, the Temple Mount of Herod was just an extension of the square Temple Mount. Okay? Remember we talked about the Hasmonean extension? There was the Seleucid Acre on the south end of the square Temple Mount. The Hasmoneans tore that down, and where do you put the rubble? Well, you got to put it somewhere. So they actually built an extension of the Temple Mount and took the rubble from the Seleucid Acre and dumped it over in this extension. Okay. Then Herod added a big chunk to the north, west, and south. Okay. Since I showed you this, I'm not going to go into too much more detail on any of that. So again, the Temple Mount was a big deal. This is one of the stones on the bottom of the Temple Mount. The Jews, after, I believe it was a 6-day war in the late 60s, they actually went down and dug along the entire length of the Temple Mount on the Western Wall. And you can go tour that today. You buy a ticket, and it's called the Western Wall Tunnel Tour or whatever. So one of the things they show you in the tour, this is a picture. I was standing up on some steps. We came down some steps for the tour. And one of the first things you see is this giant stone, okay? 44 feet long, or wide, I guess, 10 feet tall and 6 to 8 feet deep. That is a heavy piece of rock. How do they do that? Oh, well, these things, they found some wood pieces in some of these as they went and started. It might be a wood piece there that they found. But they got them there somehow. They moved them there somehow. And there's theories how they did that, whatever. But the Temple Mount was not a grading your land for building a house. It was a big, big deal. 37 acres. Okay? This is what part of the Temple Mount looked like. Okay? This picture's in the Tower of David Museum, I believe. That's a pretty popular picture. The Temple Mount is up here, of course. And you can see the very, very tippy top of the temple. Well, actually, the temple complex right there at the very top. There's a giant staircase that led up from the lower city of Jerusalem. The staircase from the lower city went up here into the royal stoa, which went across the entire southern end of the Temple Mount, okay? And it attached to the wall here at Robinson's Arch. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, where we're standing down there and I took a picture up at the remains of Robinson's Arch, okay? Barclay's Gate, I'll show you a picture of that here in just a minute also. But this is an amazing, amazing piece of construction that Herod the Great did, okay? So let me show you, first of all, Robinson's Arch. I was standing below one of the tours you can take and go and see the destruction of, you're actually below the Temple Mount, okay? You're actually looking up the wall of the Temple Mount. And you can see the stones that they pushed off from the royal stoa and Solomon's porch and the temple even. These big, just boulder things they pushed, the Romans pushed off the Temple Mount when they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. So what was left of this giant staircase was just this little piece right here. Robinson's Arch, okay, named after Charles Robinson, I think was his name. There were some, in the 1800s, I don't remember exactly when, I knew at one time, but in the 1800s, there's Barclay and Robinson and Warren and some other people that went and explored Jerusalem and found all these gates and arches and things, which is kind of cool. You can't do that today. The Muslims will not let you do that. They control the Temple Mount today. The Muslim Waqf controls the Temple Mount. So anyway, there's Robinson's Arch. Barclay's Gate is right there. Now, Barclay's Gate, turns out it's in the women's prayer area today. So if you go up to the western wall, you're at the bottom of the Temple Mount, okay? You go up, the women go to the right. There's a little dividing line. So the women go to the right, and the men go to the left, the prayer area. So you can go up to the wall and touch Herodian stones, which we did. You can put little slips of paper in the wall, which the Jews do, and they're praying at the wall and all this, but it's open to anyone. You go up there and touch the wall, do whatever, okay? But the women were only allowed on the right and the men only on the left, okay? So Barclay's Gate is on the right where the women's area is. I was not smart enough at the time to go and get a picture of that, or hand Shelley the camera and get her to get a picture of that. Luckily, we had some friends go to Israel a few months later, and they did get a picture of it. So I used their picture, and you go in the book and see who my friends are when I reference them in the book. I have a list of photographs in the back. Okay, so Barclay's Gate, right here on the picture, is right here. They had a giant lintel stone above the gate, and then the gate itself came down like so. Now, they actually built a building in front of the gate, part of the gate today, so you can only see kind of the left side of Barclay's Gate. But again, a giant, amazing undertaking by Herod the Great. Okay? If you go to the bottom of the Temple Mount, this is in the men's prayer area, which I took this picture. You see Herodian stones. There are 7 courses of Herodian stones that you can go up and touch, which is kind of cool. Now, when the Jews were, in the time of Jesus, these were probably way up there, okay? Because after this, again, I think the 6-Day War, the Jews destroyed a lot of the stuff that was there, and they dug down and made the Jewish prayer plaza, this prayer plaza in front of the western wall, okay? And they only dug down 7 courses of Herodian stones. In Jesus' time, these 7 courses were probably up there, and they were probably down to course number 22 or something, I don't know. But there's a whole bunch of courses underground that Jesus and the apostles probably could have touched. Probably not these. The temple was built in Jerusalem. This is the model at the Israel Museum. Kind of a zoom in on what's the Temple Mount, okay? It was an extensive expansion of Zerubbabel's temple that we read about at the end of the Old Testament. This is my depiction of what the temple looked like in the book on page 426. If you go to the internet, you'll find 600 different depictions or whatever. I've got a temple model one neat thing about writing a book is you get to know people. I got a postcard from Rome yesterday. A guy had traveled over there who I just happened to be kind of an internet pen pal with now. He has a neat Roman website, and when we start talking about Rome, I'm going to start using some of his stuff. But I got a picture of Rome. He said, yeah, I went and saw saw this and that and the baths of Carrie, whatever. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah. So Scott Schneider is the one that did this temple model that you can get and put together and whatever. So we've kind of been back and forth talking. And he says that the chamber of hewn stone where the Sanhedrin met, if you look at his model, is basically up here. Okay, so there's different depictions of what the temple itself looked like because it's been destroyed. The Romans completely destroyed it, right? So the court of women, we're a little bit of a misnomer. Anybody could go in the court of women. It's just the last place the women could go is the court of women. Okay, we see the various courts around, the court of Nazarites, oil, wood, whatever. Okay, then you have the court of Israelites, this very skinny little part right here, where men could go. The women were not allowed past the Nicanor gate. And then you had a little railing, and I think another step up to the court of priests, where only the priests could go. And so you see kind of a weeding out. There's a Soreg around here that weeded out all the Gentiles. This Nicanor gate weeded out Jewish women, okay? The court of the Israelites weeded out Jewish men. You get down to just priests that can go in here. And then eventually you get to where only the high priest go into the Holy of Holies, only once a year on Yom Kippur. In a few weeks, we're going to talk about all the Jewish holidays, Yom Kippur and all of them. You read about them in the Bible, so we're going to go into a lot of detail about those so you'll really understand what's going on in the Bible when they talk about these things. Okay, this is my temple model from Scott Schneider that I put together. This is the inscription that says that if you're a Gentile and you go beyond the Soreg, which is this white line here, I actually added this to my model, the white Soreg around here. If a Gentile went beyond the Soreg into this inner court, they would be put to death, and that's what this sign says. Okay, and there's actually two of those, one in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum and one in the Israel Museum. Okay. We'll pick up there next week. We'll talk about Caesarea Maritima, number 3. We have 13 of these to cover, and then we will get into the history of the sons and the history of the grandsons and the great-grandsons. That's, again, where we'll start tying it in with the Bible. Okay, and we'll see kind of that interrelationship there. Thank y'all. See you next week, I hope.